the diary. You don't carry it like that. You don't have to do this, Richard said. It was the first time he had spoken since the train had pulled out of the station on its way to London. Matt was sitting opposite him, his head buried in a book that he had brought at the station. The book was meant to be funny, but Matt couldn't even bring himself to smile. For the last hour he had been skipping from photograph to photograph, but the story simply wouldn't let him in. Richard began again. Matt snapped the book shut. You saw that what happened at Forest Hill, he said. It was Gowinder. She'd come to kill me, and she'd have killed everyone else in the school if I hadn't warned them. But you didn't warn them. You saved their lives, yes. And they all come running up to thank me for it. Matt stared out of the window, taking in the rustling countryside. Raindrops crawled slowly across the grass, moving from left to right. I can't go back, he said. They didn't want me there, and I've nowhere else to go, Miss Ashwood. Ashwood was right. Ravensgate wasn't the end of it. I didn't think it's ever going to end. It was the day after the destruction of the school. The blazing petrol had spread from the gymnasium to the old buildings, and by the time the fire brigade had arrived, there hadn't been very much left. By then. Matt had returned to the flat in York. Reports on the radio. The school did their best to keep Matt out of the newspapers, and unfortunately nobody yet knew the identity of the mad woman who had been driving the petrol tanker. But there had been too many witnesses, too many boys willing to talk, and all the headlines were screaming the same impossible story. Boy Forest School catastrophe. Did Forest Hill's boy see further? At least nobody had a photograph of Matt, apart from one muddy, almost unreasonable image that had been taken on a mobile phone. And by the time the first editors of the newspaper come out, Richard and Matt had already gone. Richard had spoken with Susan Ashwood on the phone, and she had arranged a safe house for them Leeds, an empty flat where they had stayed overnight while they were there. Matt had agreed to travel to London to meet the Nixes, just as they asked. Looking back, it seems to him that there had been something irritable about it. It wasn't meant to happen. It was planned. Susan Ashwood had said that too. She had been taking about the discovery of the Spanish monk diary, but she could just as easily have been talking about him. It was beginning to seem to Matt that his every move was being directed for him. It didn't matter what he wanted. Someone somehow had other ideas. Maybe it'll work out okay, Richard said. All you've got to do is meet this guy. William Morton got him to hand over the diary, and then you and I can go back to York or somewhere and start over again. You really think it will be as easy? You really think as it will be easy as that? Man asked. Richard shrugged. Nothing ever easy. Where you concerned, he said. But at the end of the day, Matt, you're still in control. Whatever they ask you, only have to say no. A taxi had been sent to Matt. A taxi had been sent to meet them at the station, and it took them to a hotel in Farringdon. Matt hardly knew London. The first time he had been here, he had been under police escort, whisked in and out of an office, with barely enough time to smell the air. Farringdon was an old part of the city, which seemed to slip further back in time as the evening draw on. There were dark alleyways and gas lamps, and even in places cobbled cobbled streets. If an air raid siren had suddenly split the air, Bat wouldn't have been surprised. It was the London he had seen in films that took place during the Second World War. The hotel was small and so distraught that it seemed distraught that it didn't even have a name on the front door. Richard and Matt both had rooms on the third floor. That floor paid for the course by the Nixons. After they unpacked, they took the tiny lift back to the ground floor and had an early supper together in the dining room. They were still eating when Mr. Fairbairn appeared, this time in a dark suit with black, bright, polished shoes. "Good evening," he said. "I haven't been asked to take you to the meeting, but you must finish your meal first. We have plenty of time to do. You to do. Do you mind if I join you?" He drew up a third chair and sat down. "Is it far from here?" Richard asked. "No, a short walk." Fairbairn was in a good mood. He seemed to have forgotten the way their last meeting had ended. "Can I ask you something?" Richard asked. "Please go ahead. I know nothing about you." "I mean, you once told me you lived in Lima." "In fact, I live in Barricano. It's a suburb of Lima. But what do you do? How did you get chosen by the Nixus? Do you have a wife? Are the children?" Fabian had raised a finger to his lips at the mention of the Nexus, but there was nobody else in the room, and he relaxed. "I will answer your question," he said. "No, I am not married yet. Not yet. Anyway, as to my work, I am a writer. I have written many books about my country, its history, its archaeology. That was how I come into contact with the Nixus. I was a good friend of Professor David before he was killed. It was he who recruited me." Richard and Matt finished eating. A waiter come into the room to clear away the plates. "If you're ready, Fabian began. "Lead the way," Richard replied. They left the hotel and went down the streets, walking for about 5 minutes before they arrived at a plain black door set between an estate agent's and a cafe. Fabian had a key and unlocked the door, leading them through a narrow hallway and up a flight of stairs. The second floor was more modern than the rest of the buildings, with doors of dark glass and security cameras. Matt had thought they were entering a private house, but the upper floor was more like an office. The carpet was thick, the doors were closed, everything felt silent and secretive. "It's thought dear," Fabian gasped with a hand, and as if by magic one of the doors slid open automatically. On the other side was a room with a long table and 11 people sitting together in silence waiting for them. Fabian went in ahead of them and sat down next to Susan Ashwood. That left two empty chairs, one for Richard. "Please come in." Matt wasn't sure who had spoken. All he was aware of was that everyone was looking at him. Matt felt himself beginning to blush. He didn't like being the center of attention at the best of the times, but this was definitely weird. They was staring at him as if he were a film star. He felt that at any moment they were going to break into applause. Richard walked in, Matt followed, and the door closed behind them. So this was the Nixes. Quickly Matt weighed up the 12 people sitting around the table. Now that Fabian had joined them, there were 8 men and 4 women. Them, two of the men were black and looked Chinese. The ages ranged from about 50 to 20. The oldest person in the room was wearing a clinical collar and a cuff flicks. They were all smartly dressed. Matt could imagine them sitting at the theatre together, or perhaps opera. They shared the same sort of serious. None of them were smiling. The room itself was long and narrow, with only one window giving a view over the street. The glass was tinted so that nobody outside could look in. The furniture was quite expensive, but there were no paintings or ornaments, just a number of clocks showing different times and some maps. Matt dropped into the nearest chair, trying to avoid anyone's eye, but not Richard. He was still standing by the door, looking around him in amazement. "I know you," he said. He pointed to grim-faced men sitting with a straight black and mediumly cut suit. "You're a policeman, Tarrant, isn't that your name? You're something high up in New Scotland Yard. I've seen you on television." He turned to the woman who was next to him. expensively dressed with a red hair that was surely dry, two strings of pearls around her neck, and your Natalie Johnson. Even Matt know that name. He had seen it often enough in the papers. She was sometimes called the female Bill Gates. She had made a fortune in computers and was one of the richest women in the world. Let's not bother with him. Let's let's not bother with names, Mr. Cole, she said. She had an American accent. Please take a seat and we can get started. Richard sat down next to Matt. It was difficult to be sure who was in charge. Miss Ashwood was at the end of the table, but there was no obvious leader. It was also occurred to him that someone in the room must be new. Fabian had told him that there were 12 members of the Nexus, and sure enough, there were 12 men and women. But Professor David had once been a member of the organization too, and he had died previously. He had been replaced. We are very grateful to you for coming to London, Matt. Matt, Matt, another man began his accents for was Australian. He was more casual dressed than the others, with an open-necked suit and rolled-up sleeves. He was about 40, with a pale skin and bloodshot eyes of a man who has spent too many hours on long-distance planes. We know you didn't want to be here, and we wouldn't have asked you if there was any other way. You must let us protect you, Miss Ashwood said. Her hands were resting on the table, but her fists were clenched. You were nearly killed at the Forest Hill. That can't happen. We are here only to help you. I thought it was Matt who was meant to be helping you. Richard said, we've got to help each other. The Australian went on. There's a whole lot of things we didn't know, but this much is certain: things are going to get bad, worse than you can imagine. The reason that the 12 of us are here tonight is because we want to do something about it. About what? What are you talking about, Richard? A third word World War, Miss Ashwood said, worse than the two wars that predeceased in it. Governments are out of control, destruction and death all across the planet. We didn't know exactly what form the future will take, Mr. Cole, but we think even now that we can't prevent it from happening. With your help. The bishop nodded at Matt. Look, let's get one thing straight. Richard said Matt and I didn't want to know about it, about death and destruction. We're not interested in world wars. The only help we need is to find someone else to live, because right now Yorkshire doesn't seem to be an option, and we didn't have anyone else we can turn to. The petrol tanker that drove into your school. The policeman had spoken. He left the question hanging in the air. It was driven by my aunt, Matt said. Gawenda Davis. I saw her behind the wheel. He shivered. He had known it. He shivered had he known it. Strut table. Was even at his every sense told him it was impossible. He had never liked not in all the years. He had known her, but she had never been a monster. Not until the end. Your aunt, the Australian muttered, yes. The information caused a stir in the room. The 12 members of the Nexus muttered briefly to each other, and Matt saw Fibbin write something down. You, I can't read it. She didn't know what she was doing. Susan Ashwood said to steal a petrol tanker and somehow find her way to your school. She couldn't have done it on her own. The old ones, Fibbin muttered in a low voice. Of course, they helped her. Their influenced her. Maybe they forced her, but undoubtedly they were behind it. All right, Richard, cut in. You won't use to go and meet this man. William Morton, Matt agreed to that, but I'm telling you now, if he means putting him in any more danger, that's the last thing in our minds. The American woman said. She leant forward, her long hair falling over her eyes. She must have been about 50 years old, but she had obviously spent a lot of money making herself look younger. All right, Richard, you don't mind if I call you that, do you? Let's give it to you straight. We need Matt to meet with this guy, William Morton, tomorrow at 12 o'clock, because it's the only way we think we can get him to hand over the diary. But Matt is more important than the diary right now. If he really is who we think he is, he's just about the most important kid in the world. You've told Morton that Matt is one of the five. Richard said. He was speaking slowly, working it out as he went, and Morton wants to meet him to see if he's true, but how's he going to do that? Is Matt going to have to see it into the future, blowing something up to provide it? He didn't know, Natalie replied. Remember, he's read the diary. We haven't. He may know more than do. All we know is that he's afraid. Miss Ashford is afraid of the man he was dealing with in South America, and he's afraid of what he's read in the diary itself. William Morton has realised he stumbled into something bigger and darker than anything he's experienced in his life, and he's looking for a way out. Where does he want to meet me? Asked that. At first he wouldn't tell us. This time it was a Frenchman who had picked up the story. He was slim and grey-haired and looked like a lawyer. He spoke to us only with his mobile phone. He gives us no idea where he can be found, but now he has mentioned a church in the city, not so far from here. St. Methodist in Moore Street. Miss Ashwood said he will be there at 12 o'clock tomorrow. He will meet with you, but he will meet with you, but with you alone. Matt's not going in there on his own. Richard said. He tells us that he will be watching out for the boy. The Frenchman said, we have not described to him what Matt looks like, but it's unlikely that there will be any other 14-year-old or adolescents near the church at the time the deal. It's it's very simple, Matt. It's not alone. Monster and Matt Morton will disappear. We will never see him again. And whoever it is that he has been dealing with in South America, we have the diary. Why this church? Richard asked. It seemed to be a strange place to meet. Why not a restaurant or a cafe? Or something like that. Morton instantly Natalie said, I guess we'll find out the answer to that when Matt gets there. Maybe the church is mentioned in the diary. The bishop suggests as it happens that St. Mary's is one of the oldest churches in the city. In fact, there's been a church on the site since the Ages, and now can we be sure Matt will be safe there? For all we know, this mystery South America businessman or whoever he is could have already got to Morton. This could all be a trap. Leave that to me, the policeman said. Richard had been right. His name was Terence. His name was Terence, and he was an assistant commissioner, one of the highest ranking officers in London. I'll have access to the security cameras all around Mall Street. We can't go into the church, but I'll make sure there are 100 officers in the immediate area. One word from me and they'll move in. But I still didn't understand what happened. Matt said this man, William Morton, meets me. Maybe he asked me some questions. But what then is he going to give me the diary? He said he'll sell it to us if he believes you naturally replace he's not giving it to you to anyone. He still wants his money. There was a purse. Richard turned to Matt. Do you want to go? He asked. Matt shook his head. No, I don't, he said. He glanced around the table. Everyone was staring at him. He could see his own face reflected in the black glasses that covered Susan Ashwood's eyes. But I will, he went on, if you'll give me something in return. What do you want? The Australian asked. You people have a lot of influence. You stopped Richard getting his article about Omega One published in the newspaper, so maybe you can get him a job here in London. Richard began. That's what you always wanted, Matt said, and I want to go to ordinary school. I'm not going back to Forrestal. I want you all to promise me that if you get the diary, you leave me alone. I'm not sure we can promise that, Fairbairn said. You're part of us, all of this. Matt, don't you see that? But if there's any way we can leave you out of this, we will, Miss Ashwood cut in. We don't like this anymore than you do, Matt. We never wanted to bring you here. Matt nodded. All right, a decision had been made. But when now, Matt wasn't convinced that he'd been the one who'd made it much later that night as he lay in his bed on the third floor of a hotel. He He told him that soon it would be all over. He'd meet Morton, he'd get the diary, and that would be the end of it. But somehow he didn't believe it. Everything that had happened in the last Everything that happened next would be the same. There was no way out for him. He had get used to it. There were strange forces all around him, and they were never going to let him go. 2,000 miles away, a man was approaching his desk. It was the middle of the afternoon here in the town of Alicia, south of Peruvian capital of Lima. Peru was 6 hours behind Britain. The sun was shining brilliantly, and as the room was open to the elements with a third floor that stretched past a row of pillars into the courtyard, the entry room was floored with light high above a ceiling fan turned slowly, not actually cooling anything, but giving the illusion that it might. The man couldn't hear. Man could hear the gentle sound of water splashing. There was an old fountain in the courtyard. A few chickens pecked at the gravel. Floors grew everywhere, and the scent hungry heavily in the air. The man was 57 years old, dressed in a white intersal suit that hung off him stiffly as if he was still in the wardrobe. He moved slowly and with a difficult reaching out with his hands to find his chair and lower himself into it. His body was all wrong. He was unfortunately tall, well over 6 feet, but what gave him his extra height was his head, which was twice as long as it should be. It was a huge with eyes so high up that no, but that on anyone else they would have been in the middle of a forehead. He had a few tufts of hair that were really no colour at all, but mainly he was bald with liver spots all over his skin. His nose extended all the way down to his mouth, which was too small in relation to everything else. A child's mouth in an adult's face, a muscle twitched in the side of his neck as he moved. The neck was obviously struggling to hold up such a great weight. The man's name was Digao Salamander. and and he was the chairman of one of the largest companies in South America. Salamanda's News International had built an empire with newspapers and magazines, TV stations, hotels, and telecom communications. Some people claimed that SNI owned Peru, and Diego Salamanda was the sole owner, the chairman, and single stockholder of SNI. His ad began stretched quietly despicable lately. It was a practice from more than 1,000 years before some of the ancient tribes of Peru had selected newly born babies whom they believed to be special and had forced them to live with their hands sandwiched between two wooden planks. This was what caused the abandoned growth. It was supposed to be an honor of supposed to be an honor of Solomon's parents, known that their baby was special, so they had done the same to him, and he was grateful to them. They had caused him pain, they had made him hideous, they had prevented him from even enjoying a normal human relationship. relationship, but they had been right. They had recognized his talents. The very day he was born, the telephone rang, still moving slowly. Salamander reached out and took the receiver. It looked slightly ridiculous, far too small as he held it against his ear. Yes, he didn't need to give his name. This was a private number, only a handful of people had it, and they would know who they were calling. It was 12 o'clock tomorrow. The voice at the other end said, "He's going to be at the church in London, at St Methodist." A very good. Both of them were speaking English. It was the language that Salamander used for all his businesses. Would what do you want me to do? Is the voice asked. You have done enough, my friend, and you will be rewarded. Now you can leave it to me. What will you do? Solomon paused. An ugly light glimmered in his straightly colourless eyes. He didn't like being asked questions, but he was in a generous mood. "I will take the daddy and kill Mr. Morton," he replied, "and the boy. If the boy is there, then of course I will kill him too." The church was behind Seraph in the 14 backwater of London. That really it wasn't like London at all. At school, Matt had learned about the Blitz when German bombers had destroyed great chunks of the city's particularly in the East End. What the teachers had told him was that the blank spaces and rubble had been replaced with modern concrete officers' blocks, multi-story car parks, cheap tacky shops, and cutting between them. wide, enormous highways that carried an endless stream of traffic, what with a lot of noise but not a great deal of speed. He had been brought here by taxi dropped off at the end of Moore Street, which turned out to be Grubby Lane running between a pub and a laundrette. The church stood at the bottom between a pub and laundrette, the bottom end, looking sad and out of place. It had been bombed too. A new steeple. A new steep. A stone pillar arch. Torn end, sad and out of place. It has been bombed. A new steeple had been added for some time in the last 20 years, and it didn't quite match the stone pillars and archway doors below St. Matthew's was surprisingly large, and at one time must have been quite grained, standing at the centre of a 15 community, but the community had moved. On the church looked fallen and straight abandoned once again. Matt wondered if they were there the bookseller William Morton had chosen this place for their meeting, but at least they would have no difficult recognising each other. There were a few people around, and certainly no sign of a human armed policeman that the assistant communist had promised. As Matt made his way down the lane, the door of the pub opened, and a bearded man with a broken nose stepped out. It was only 12 o'clock, but he was already drunk, or perhaps he was still hungover from the night before. Matt quickened his pace. There was a mobile phone in his pocket, and Richard Cole was only a few minutes away. If he needed help, Matt wasn't afraid. He just wanted to get this over with and go back to normal ordinary life. He walked up to the front door of the church, wondering if he would even be able to get in. The door was very solid and somehow gave the impression of being locked. He reached out and lifted the handle. It was cold and heavy in his hand. He turned reluctantly with a cracking sound. The door swung open and Matt stepped forward, passing from bright daylight to a strange shadow-filled interval. The sound was shut out. The sound of the traffic disappeared. Matt had left the door open, but it swung closed beneath him. The boom of the wood hitting the frame echoed through the empty space. He was standing at the end of a nerve which stretched out to an altar some distance away. There were no electric lights in the church, and the stained glass windows were electric. Too dusty or too darkly coloured to let in any light, but there were about a
Put your tools back yet?
No, thank you.
What's up? Are you frightened you're going to hurt yourself?
Yeah, I don't want to back it.
No, I'm just saying, are you frightened?
Yeah.
Oh, why?
No, I just don't want back it.
Okay.
too dark or too coloured to let in any light, but there were about 1,000 candles illuminating the way forward, flickering together in little crowds gathered around the chapels and arcades that lined the sides of the building as Matt's eyes got used to the gloom. He made out vicious figures, old man and woman kneeling in the pause of unst up in front of the tombstones, looking like ghosts that had somehow drifted up from the catacombs below. He swallowed. He was linking this less and less, and he wished now that he had inserted on Richard coming with him. The journalist had wanted to be, but Fabian and the other members of the Nexus had discussed him. That was to enter alone. That was what they had agreed with William Morton, and if they broke faith, they may never see him again. Matt looked around, but there was no sign of a bookseller. He remembered the face he had seen on the DVD. At least he would know what he looked like when Mr. Morton chose to reveal himself. Where was he hiding? Somewhere in the shadows, perhaps. Well, that made sense. He would check that Matt was alone. If someone had come with him, there would be other ways out of a church. Morton could slip away without ever being seen. Matt continued down towards the altar, passing a caved wooden pulpit shaped like an eagle. The priest would address the congestion from above its outspread wings. The walls of the church were lined with paintings, a saint slot full of arrows, another broken on a wheel, a crucifixion wielded. Religions religions have to be so dark and cruel. As he arrived at the apse just in front of the altar where the east wings of the church spread out, forming a cross, a man stood up and gestured to him. The man had been sitting in a paw, his hand half hidden in his hands. Matt recognized him at once. He was overweight, with silver hair in tufts on either side of a round balded head, rugged cheeks and smell-watery eyes. The man was wearing a crumpled suit and no tie. There was a package wrapped in brown paper in his hands. Matthew Freeman, he asked. I'm Matt. Matt never used his full name. You know who I am. William Morton, the bookseller, appeared to be a very different man from the one Matt had seen in the television interview. Something had cut through his arrogance and self-regain, both physical and mentally. He seemed to have shrunk now that they were close. Matt could see that he hadn't shaved. Silver stumble was spreading across his cheeks and down to his neck, and he probably hadn't changed his clothes in days. He smelled bad, he was sweating. "You're very young," Morton blinked a couple of times. "You're just a kid. What were you expecting?" Matt didn't try to keep the enormous out of his voice. He didn't like being called a child. He still didn't know what this was all about. "They didn't tell you?" Morton asked. "They told me you had a book, a diary." Matt glanced at the brown paper packages, and Morton drew it close to him, holding it more tightly. "Is that it?" Morton didn't answer. They said you wanted to meet me. What went on? They want to buy it from you. "I know what they want." Morton glanced left and right. Suddenly he was suspicious. "You come here alone?" he hissed. "Yes, come this way." Before Matt could see anything, Morton scuffled along the length of the paw and began to move down the side of the church, leaving the other worshippers behind. Matt followed slowly. It occurred to him that the bookseller might be a little mad, but at the same time he knew it was worse. That that worse than that. He thought back to the farmer, Tom Burgess, who had spoken to him outside the nuclear reactor at Lesser Malling, and had later died. He had been just the same as he walked into the darkness in the further corner of the church. Matt realised that William Morton was scared out of his wits. Morton waited for him to catch up, then began to speak the words, tumbling over each other in a low gabble. There was nobody else around in this part of the church. Presumably that was why he had chosen it. "I should never have brought the diary," he said, but I know it, I know I know what it was. You seen heard of the old ones. I know a little of this history. Not very much, of course. Nobody know why very much. But when I saw the diary in the market in Cobbledaro, I recognised it immediately. There were people who said it didn't even exist, and many more who thought that the author, St. Joseph of Cordora, was mad. The mad monk, that's what they call him. And there it was, incredible waiting for him to pick it up. The only written history of the old ones, Gravinsky and the Five. As he spoke this last words, his eyes widened and he stared at Matt. It was only there. He went on, the beginning of a our world, the first great war. It was only one by trick. It is there. Is that the diary day mattered as a second time? This was all moving too quickly for him. It was all the diary. What Matt asked a second time was all moving too quickly for him. I thought it would been worth fortune. Morton was whispered. This thought were very bookseller dreams of finding a first edition or the only copy of the book that has been lost to the world, and this was much more than that. I went on television and told everyone what I had in my hands. I boasted, and that was the most stupid mistake I could have made. Why? Why? Because somehow in the church, someone dropped a hymn book. It fell to the floor with a thunderous echo, and Morton's eyes wisp, wi- wi- uh, whipped around as if a shot had been fired. Matt could see the sneasel bulging on the side of his neck. The bookseller looked as if he was on the edge of a heart attack. He waited a moment until everything was silent again. I shouldn't have been more careful, he continued, speaking a whisper. I should have read the diary first, maybe then I would have understood. Understood what? It's an evil. Morton took out a handkerchief and wiped it across his brow. Have you ever read a horror story, Matt, one that you can't get out of your mind, one that stays and torments you when you want to go to sleep? The diary is like that, only worse. It speaks of creatures that'll come into this world of events that will take place. I don't understand it all, but what I do understand won't leave me alone. I can't sleep, I can't eat. My life has been turned upside down. Then why didn't you just sell it? You've been offered millions of pounds, and you think I'll live to enjoy a penny of it? Morton laughed briefly. Since I read the diary, I've had nightmares, horrible nightmares, and then I woke up and I think they're all over, but they not because they're real. The shadows that I have seen reaching out for me aren't just in my imagination. Look, a sleeve. He pulled back a sleeve and Matt winced. It looked as if Morton had tried to cut his wrists. There were half a dozen Merrill-lined recent wounds criss-crossing each other a couple of centimetres from his hand. You did that, Matt asked. Maybe I did, maybe I didn't. I didn't remember. I woke up in the morning and there cuts and bruises, blood on the sheets, and I'm in pain. He rubbed his eyes, fighting for control, and that's not all. Oh no, I didn't see things properly any more ever since I read the book. All I see are the shadows and the darkness of people walking the streets are dead to me, even the animals, the dogs and the cats. They look at me as if they're going to leap out and once again he was forced to stop. And things happen. He continued just now coming here today. A car nearly ran me down. It was as if the driver hadn't seen him or had seen him I seen me and didn't care. Do you think I'm going mad? will ask yourself what happened to my house. It burned down. I was there. The fire just started all on. The fire just started all on its own. It came from nowhere. The door slammed shut. The telephone stopped working. Do you see what I'm saying? Do you understand? The house wanted to kill me. It wanted me dead. Matt know that at least part of this was true. The Nixons had already told him about the fire. I'm said I have the diary. I've read all its secrets, and now it won't let me live when they didn't. You just get rid of it. Matt struggled. Why don't you set fire to it or something? Morton nodded. I thought of that. Of course I have, but there's the money. He licked his lips, and it was then that. Matt saw the true horror of Morton's predicament. He was beginning torn between the fear and greed. It was a constant battle, and it was destroying him. £2 million. It's more than I've ever earned. I can't just throw it away. I be able How would I be able to live with myself? No, I'll sell it. That's what I am, a bookseller. I'll sell it and I'll take the money and then it'll leave me alone. You have to sell it to us, Matt said. I know. That's why I agreed to meet you for boys and girls. They're in the diary. You're one of them. Of the five. Everyone calls me that, Matt interrupted, but I didn't even know what it means. Ever since I got tangled up in all this, I've been trying to find a way out. I'm sorry, Mr. Morton. I know you want to prove something to you, but I can't. Morton shook his hand, refusing to believe what Matt had just told him. I know about the first gate, he said. Raven's Gate. There's a second gate. There's a second gate. It's all in here. Then give it to me. Suddenly Matt was tried. If you really wanted to get rid of the diary, and I'm the only person you'll give it to, that I'm fine. Give it to me. You'll get your money, and then maybe we can both go home and forget all about that. All about that. Morton nodded. That for a brief moment Matt thought it was all over. Matt would hand over the package, and he and Richard would be on the next train, however. But of course, it wasn't going to be easy as that. I thought I have to be sure that you are who you say you are. Morton rasped. You have to prove it to me. Matt's hand swam, and I've already told you I can't do that. Yes, you can. Morton was gripping the book so tightly that his fingers had turned white. He looked quickly around the church, once again making sure they weren't overhead. Do you see the door? He asked. What door? There's Morton twitched his head, and Matt looked past him to a strange wooden door set in the stone wall that was strange about it. It took him a few moments to work it out. It was too small, about half the size of all the other doors in the church. He assumed it must led into the streets. It was set below a stained glass window with gloomy paintings on either side. Looking more closely, he was that there was something carved in the wood, a symbol. It was pentagram, a star with 5 points. It's why I chosen this place to meet. It's in the diary. That's not possible. Matt tried to work it out. The diary had been written in the 16th century, over 100 years ago. Parts of this church were older, parts of it were quite modern. Either way, how could the monk have known about the existence of a single door? Of course, it's not possible. Morton agreed, but it doesn't matter. I want you to go through the door, and I want you to bring me something from the other side. It doesn't matter what it is. Whatever you choose will prove to me that you are here. You are who they say you are. What's on the other side? You tell me. Bring me whatever you find. I'll wait for you here. Why don't you come with me? Morton laughed, but without a shred of warmth of humour. You really do know nothing, he said. Suddenly his voice was heard again. We didn't have time to argue. Do as I say, do it, or now I'll leave, and you will never hear from me again. But signed, Matt signed. He didn't understand any of it, but there was no point in answering back. He wanted this to be over. This then went over to the door. Slowly he reached out his hand, resting on the iron handle. It was only now that he saw that all through the door was too small for the church. It was perfectly in position to its own height. It had been built for a child. He turned the handle, opened the door, and stepped through. While Matt and William Morton had been taking, neither of them had heard the front door of the church open again, nor had they seen the man. They seen the man who had come. Who had come in here. He was still dirty, dressed in rags, with a beard and broken nose. Matt had noticed him in Street when he had come out of a pub pretending to be drunk. The man took for a moment, allowing his eyes to become used to this gloom, then moved down to the apes. It didn't take him long to find the bookseller. Morton was standing next to a half-sized door, shifting his ample weight from one foot to the other as if he was waiting to go into the dentist. There was a square parcel wrapped in brown paper held in one hand, the diary. It seemed that the boy had gone, but the boy wasn't important. The man with the broken nose had been paid to kill Morton and take the book. If the boy was there, he wouldn't die too, but he wasn't, and the man was exactly pleased killing children was occasionally necessary, but always unpleasant. He reached into the pocket of his raincoat and took something out. The knife was only about 10 centimeters long, but that didn't matter. The man knew how to use it. He could kill with a knife half that size. The man looked at the altar ahead of him and briefly crossed himself, using the blade of the knife. The pointer touched his chest, both his shoulders. Then, with a smile, he moved forward. It took too hot. That's what Matt first thought when he had gone into the church, it had been normal London summer's day, that it had been sunny but cool, and most people had been glad it wasn't raining. He had only been in the church for a few minutes, but at that time the sun seemed to have intensified, and the sky was the wrong colour. It was a vivid Mediterranean blue. All the clouds had disappeared, and that wasn't the only thing that was wrong. Matt had been sure what he had found on the other side of the door. He had been half expecting to step back out into Moss Street. Instead, he was in a cluster of covered walkways forming a square around a country yard with a fountain in the middle. Well, there was nothing surprising about that lot of churches and cloisters. It was where the priest went to walk and to think about the next sermon of whatever. But this cloister was completely different from the church. It looked older and more beautiful. The pillars of the house were more ornate, and the fountain was really lovely, carved from some sort of white stone, with crystal clear water sparkling, sprinkling, splashing down from one base to another. Matt know almost nothing about an architecture, but even he could see that there was something about the fountain that wasn't quite English. The same was true of old cloister. He cast his eyes from the perfect mowed grass to the brilliant flowers tumbling out of huge terracotta pots. How could a church as shabby and as neglected as St. Meredith's have managed to hold on the courtyard as perfect as this? He looked back at the church he just left, and that was was another thing. Was he going mad, or was the brickwork somehow different on the outside? There was a square tower raising up above him, but no sign of a steeple, modern or otherwise. Well, perhaps it was hidden by the angel of the wall. Subscribe, hit the bell, share, like, thank you. Watch my other videos from start to finish. Click on my thumbnail, click on my end screen. Subscribe, hit the bell, share, like, thank you. Watch my videos from start to finish. Click on my end screen, your thumbnail. Watch my videos from start to finish. Thank you. Subscribe, hit the bell, share, like, thank you.